Hi everyone, welcome back. This is our second exam technique video for GCSE Business Edexcel. In this video, we're going to look at short answer questions. So we're going to look at 1, 2, and 3 markers, but we're going to look at them in reverse because, well, the 3 markers are worth 3 times more marks than the 1 markers, and so we're going to give them 3 times more attention. So in terms of short answer questions, the main type of question that you would see is a 3 mark, and these questions always look like this. So explain one benefit to a small business of carrying out market research. So the key thing is focusing on the words of the question, and then in terms of the way these are marked, you want to make your point, and then you want to add 2 links. Now that could be, as we mentioned in our introduction video, it could be because leads to, for, anything like that. Any kind of connectives really will give you those links or those chains of reasoning that allow you to not just state a benefit to a small business of carrying out market research, but actually kind of take that further and explain the links and what that leads to, that means for a business, why it's a benefit, rather than just saying something's a benefit. So the first thing that's worth bearing in mind is these questions are only found on section A, so they don't require a case study, but there are quite a lot of them. There are 6 of these on each paper. That means 18 of the 90 marks on the paper come from these 3 mark questions, so it's really important to maximize these marks. Now, you could use a BLT. BLT is certainly, how I kind of encourage my students to use connectives, but you don't have to. And, if it doesn't naturally flow because leads to therefore, you can use any kind of connective, such as this means that or something like that. You can use these in a different order. It's not prescriptive. It's just something to kind of help students create these links. So we're going to have a look at some example answers. Mike's going to talk us through kind of why these get the marks that they get. So the 2 questions we're going to have a look at are explain one way a small business could use market segmentation to target customers, and explain one disadvantage to a small business of using qualitative data for market research. Mike, do you want to explain how these questions are marked?
Yeah, so it's fairly straightforward. So like you mentioned, there's a knowledge mark, which is for the point, and there's as you put the U mark, some teachers will put L's for links and things. You need 2 of those, and you're going to be using connectives to get those. The key thing is going through the thought process. So if you look at this question, it's the first thing to notice is a one-way question. So it's not a benefit, an impact, or a drawback, or a negative, or disadvantage, I should say. It's a way question, so you need to be very descriptive, just mentioning steps that could be taken by the business. So, and then the next thing you want to look at is the key term, so market segmentation. So you need to show that you understand market segmentation in the answer to get any marks whatsoever, and then you also need to use descriptive chains. So if we read through this, one way a business could use market segmentation to target customers is by targeting gender. So that gets us the first mark. It shows we understand that market segmentation is about dividing up the market into very specific kind of subsections, and gender could be one of those. So that gets 1 mark for the point. This is because different products can be targeted at customers depending on whether they are male or female. So the business are then going to decide we're going to make a product that is aimed at male or female. So therefore that gets the next step in the chain. So that gets the 2nd mark. And then the student then finally says this leads to a business being able to meet customer needs and therefore increased added value. Now that would be a great chain if it was a benefit to the business question, but we need to remember that this is a way question, and that is not being descriptive of a step that they would then take to target a male or female group of customers. So therefore you need to give an example. So for example, you may develop an aftershave, for example, to target males, or a perfume to target females. If you was say Calvin Klein, that would have then got the student the 3rd mark.
So then the second one was explain one disadvantage to a small business of using qualitative data for market research. So Mike, do you want to talk through this one as well?
Yeah, sure. So again, we're looking for a point. So this is a disadvantage question, and we need to show in the answer that we understand what qualitative data is. So let's have a look. One disadvantage to a business of using qualitative data is that the data is difficult to interpret. So that gets us a point, 1 mark for knowledge, because you are showing understanding of a problem, a potential problem, with qualitative data. So the student then says this is because the data is non-numeric and based on opinions. So that gets you the next mark because you are explaining why, and you're explaining the problem with it, and you're also showing knowledge understanding that qualitative is different to quantitative because it's non-numeric. So we're not worried, is this going to get 0 or 3? Finally, the student says, this leads to it being difficult to group responses, therefore makes decision making more difficult / unreliable. Now that just about gets the 3rd mark, because let's say you had a range of opinions, you may not then have a really pinpoint way to change the product's, say, appearance with such a wide range of opinions. Whereas if you had statistical data, that would be much easier for you to make a decision.
So yeah, that first example will get 2 marks. The second example will get 3. And I think the thing that we want to make it really clear here to students is you've got to pay attention to the words of the question. What does the examiner want to see? Is it explain one way? Is it explain one disadvantage? Because while the requirements are the same, knowledge and then 2 understanding points or point and 2 links, it has to be really specific to what that question's asking for. You've got to demonstrate your knowledge, but you have to make sure you're answering what the question is actually asking. So we wanted to give 2 examples, and we wanted to also potentially show you some potential pitfalls you can fall into by, and then just costing yourself a mark, which could obviously be costly at the end of the whole paper. Now, that's the 3 marker. That's the main sort of type of question in these small answer sections. We're going to go through 2 mark outline question as well. So an outline question is like this example on screen. Outline one risk taken by the owners when starting last course participation. So with the case for all of these 2 markers is these questions mention a business specifically. You can see in the question there, last course patisserie. That would have been a case study in an exam. Your answer therefore must be applied. Can't just be a general risk that an owner might take. It has to be a risk that they have taken when they've started their business. So you need to use a quote or a reference from the extract. It doesn't have to be like with quote marks, although I know quite often students prefer to do it because it makes it easy to show that you've definitely applied. It just needs to be a clear reference to something that case study. And then obviously in addition to that, to get the second mark, use a link or a connective like we've just talked about, because leads to, therefore, to get that second mark. So here's a different example. So outline one risk for Tesco of the increased competition in the grocery market. So your first mark would come from Tesco risk losing market share and sales. But that doesn't have any link to the extract. That's just the point, the risk. Because lower cost rivals such as Aldi and Lidl grow in popularity. So there's a clear reference to that business. It's something specific. It's not, you've not just said Tesco, you've mentioned something that you would only know by reading that case study or knowing that market. There are some other 2 markers, but they're all calculation questions, and so we're not going to focus on those in this video. So Mike, do you want to start talking us through the range of 1 mark questions? There's a number of different 1 mark questions available, and they're only 1 mark, so we don't want to spend too much time on it. It's important to just make sure students understand the difference.
Yeah, definitely. So we start off with multiple choice questions, which are at the start of the sections. They're meant to be a nice, easy kind of warm up for the student to then get them going for when the questions get a little bit trickier. So there can be 1 or 2 marks. Just be really careful of that, because I know even in the end of unit assessments, all of mine are ticking 1 when it says state 2 and throwing away, an easy mark, or at least a stab at an easy mark. Read the question very carefully, like for example, is it fixed costs or is it variable costs they're looking for, before you then start ticking away, and try to avoid the traps. Jack, what do they mean by traps?
I think the traps are like, if you take a multiple choice question that is, for example, give an example of an element of the market and mix, automatically some students will think about the 4 Ps, and so quite often the other options that aren't the correct options will be other words that begin with P, to try and trick the lazy student who isn't completely paying attention to what the question's actually saying and what the other options are, to try and trip them into the easy answer. They might see the word process and very quickly tick that one, thinking, right, well, it begins with P and I'll move on. And so just making sure you're reading the question avoids those little traps.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the main one is when they put, like, say, people or process in there at the 7 Ps, and then it's wrong.
Yeah.
Very mean.
There were also some define questions. So, what more to say? Define the key term, but just make sure you're specific with your definition. Make sure it's demonstrating that you know what you're talking about. You don't need to create any links here. You just say what the key term is.
You have give, which is usually based on applications. You're given an example of. So, give an example of a fixed cost in section A would just be generic. So, it could just be rent. Giving an example of a fixed cost in a section B question would more likely be the rent of their store at last course patisserie.
Yeah, so sometimes they'll differentiate those with given state, with the state ones being the ones in sections B and C where it has to come from the case study. But I know that
Oh,
isn't
good shout.
necessarily always consistently applied. So the key thing is just if you're in section B or you're in section C and there was a business mentioned in the question, just make sure you find an example from the case study. And because, like I say, the answer is given to you, you just got to find the extract. But just make sure that in section A you don't need that. You just need to be able to use your brain, use your knowledge, use your memory. But in section B and C, you're gonna have to find the answer. The last one is an identify question. So these ones always come from a graph. So it's kind of like a numeric question, but instead of actually having to do a calculation, you just have to interpret information from a graph. So this could be a pie chart showing market share. It could be a stock diagram or something like that, a break-even chart, where you just have to identify something like a particular business's sales or market share or something like that. An ASS application, you just need to say the answer. You don't need to write a full sentence. If for example, it was which mobile network has the most market share in the mobile network market, you can just write EE. You don't need to write a full sentence like the answer is EE or anything like that. So again, obviously, it goes without saying that those answers, hopefully, those 1 markers are going to be nailed on 1 marks. The 2 markers are going to be nailed on 2 marks. And then those 3 markers with that structure that we're trying to give you, that little support. You will hopefully be able to get as many of them as possible. So this is the second video in this series. There's going to be 3 more to come. 1 on 6 markers, 1 on 9 markers, and 1 on 12 markers. So make sure you keep an eye on the channel and watch those videos as well. If you've got any questions, then pop those in the comments and we'll have a look and see if we can give you a little bit of help. And I've also added some Quizlet links into the description for anyone who wants a little bit of help with using their key terms and remembering those key terms, which will be really important for these short answer questions. So thanks for paying attention and watching, and we'll see you soon.